This is MEC 130, motors and drives. Here we can see a 3-wire circuit, which leads to the motor. So we're going to start at number 1. First we can see 3-wire circuit. This is coming from L1, L2, and L3. And that comes directly over to L1, L2, and L3 on the contactor. But in between, we have an emergency button that comes off of L1 into 1. Number 1 comes to number 2, which comes to the push button control. From there, we see 4 leads to the contactor on, I believe, A1. A1 is connected to 14, and 14 is also alters between 13. That leads to the overload relay, and the overload relay is connected to the motor, completing the 3-wire circuit. So this circuit starts at L1 and leads to the 1 for the emergency. 2 leads to the neutral. We come back. L1 also connects to L1 on the contactor. L2 connects directly to 96 on the overload relay. And then L3 connects to L3 on the contactor. L1 goes to T1, which leads to L1. L1 goes to T1. T1 comes down to the motor to T1. L2 also comes to L2 on the contactor and leads to T2. T2 heads to the overload relay to L2, and then heads to T2, which also heads to the motor. And then T3 does a similar L3 to L3 to T3 to L3 to T3 to T3, which completes the 2-wire wiring. We have our emergency button at the beginning that goes from L1. The 2 leads to the neutral once again. We can turn it on by heading towards the voltage of L. That L leads to A1, which leads to A2, which leads to 95, which connects to 96. This is the 2-wire wiring setup. This misses out on the push buttons that 3-wire has as a secondary safety. When I click the emergency button and turn it back on, as you can see the emergency button is kind of flawed here, because when I just turn it off and turn it back on, we see that we have regained power without resetting the system. 3-wire, we would be resetting the system through the push buttons after the emergency button has been reset. Now we've added directional control. Directional control comes from the selector switches, which act like relays.
When we get to that point.
And they come over to the overload relay. And then they head down to the motor itself. The selector switch simulates switching this lead with this lead. thus changing the direction. We can see counterclockwise, actually clockwise, and then counterclockwise with the switch of the directional control. As we can see, the stop button operates, the start button operates, the emergency button operates.